do express our sympathy to Mary Ann Drake's family, her passing. Sleep, didn't wake up. That's your heart.
Much better can it be.
The way you want to go.
You know, I mean,
Where do you want to go? We are looking at conversations that Jesus had. We're going to begin, we're going to begin in Matthew 16 and do that one very quickly, and then go to Matthew 22. So we're going to stay in Matthew. But I wanted to give a background, a good background on Sadducees. We're going to talk about Jesus' conversation with Sadducees. We don't have a lot of conversations and not a lot of lengthy conversations with Sadducees, but they are there and they are a prominent group. The Sadducees themselves started probably around, according to what Josephus and some others have written, around 165 BC. They started, just like the Pharisees, they started in that intertestamental period. And when you look at the Sadducees, we often talk about they're sad. And the reason they're sad is because of their beliefs. And we'll talk about those in just a second. But we have to look at the Sadducees and understand that they really didn't last that long. If they started in 165 BC and it's known that or believed that they ended about 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed, the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they didn't last that long. But they were rich. They were the aristocracy of their time. They were not as plentiful as the Pharisees, but they were sort of the ruling class. Well, let's get a little bit down. We'll come back to those thoughts. When you look at the Sadducees, you don't see much with regards to the pages of the New Testament like you see the Pharisees, and that's because of their number. They were smaller. The Sadducees began, like I said, in 165 BC. Their name, origin of their name, I guess is probably a better way of saying it. The origin of their name, we're not exactly sure. There's been two lines of thought. First of all, some have said that they were named after a man by the name of Zadok. We find him in the pages of the Old Testament. And they were just out of his lineage and his name. That's probably not correct. It might be, but it's probably not correct. Although when you begin to study it and begin to look at some things that are written with regards to them, you find that statement more times than not. But it's also possible that the name itself comes from the Hebrew word Sadak. Sadak, the Hebrew word, just simply means to be righteous. And so these folks intended on being righteous. They were, as we said, they were the aristocracy. They were the rich group. They were the rich kids, and they ruled as such. They didn't write a lot about themselves. But matter of fact, really, not all the things that we have about the Sadducees pretty much secondhand. Josephus and some other historians wrote about them, but not a lot. Folks didn't like them. If you weren't a Sadducee, folks didn't like them. And Pharisees and Sadducees didn't really get along. And part of that is because of beliefs. And I kind of want to tie something in the thought-wise here in just a minute with regards to that. The Sadducees themselves were a group that they wanted to keep peace. And so they often kind of gave themselves to whatever Rome said. Bible was important to them, and they only believed in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, Pentateuch. That's all they believed. Different from the Pharisees. Now, we'll talk about more specifically some of their beliefs here in just a second, but the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that the Pharisees believed in the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. But they also believed in the oral law, the oral tradition. The oral law was just that. It was an oral law that was passed down from generation to generation. It was that which was thought about, if you will, the law. And so what you have, if you go back and study the Old Testament, what you have is you have the Old Testament, but then you have also what's called the Mishnah, especially, and which is the writings with regards to the interpretations, with regards to the old law. And the Pharisees kind of held all of that. The Sadducees believed in Genesis through Deuteronomy, and that's it. In other words, this is what the law says. This is what you do. There was no oral interpretation or somebody else's interpretation written down years ago. It was just believing in what we would say believe in the Bible. But they played a little loose with that because they understood something. And you got to remember that Israel at this New Testament times was under Roman rule and Roman authority. And Rome, and really this was a blessing for Christianity, if you stop and think about it, because Rome pretty much let the people do what they wanted to do. As long as there wasn't an upheaval, an uprising, as long as there wasn't trouble in the land, number one, and number two, as long as they sent their taxes back to Rome. Rome kind of let them do. And at the same time, too, Rome was willing to spend money to kind of help make things a little better every once in a while. And so Roman rule was really a blessing for Christianity because it also gave a freedom there. And if you go back, especially to the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome that came about, one of the things you find out is that travel, and we see that, we see Paul traveling, we see Jesus traveling. Well, they were able to travel. Why? Because Rome let them be free. You might say, well, why is that so important? Well, with Rome having those stipulations, trouble was just, little skirmishes here and there between one or two people, not great groups. You keep spending us your tax money, and everything's going to be all right. You'll have freedom. Not only was that good for Christianity, but that was what the Sadducees said, we want to keep. We want to keep that peace. We want to keep Rome happy, but we don't want them to come in with a heavy hand. And so they would kind of give in every once in a while to Rome and to what they had going on. And so they were more concerned with politics than they were with religion. You might say, well, that means they were a little looser in their interpretation. Well, don't pat them on the back and be hard on the Pharisees, but don't be hard on the Pharisees and pat them on the back. They weren't righteous either. There are times in which they didn't follow the law. They didn't follow what the scriptures teach. And so the Sadducees, in trying to preserve the word of God, especially Genesis through Deuteronomy, sometimes kind of fudge a little bit. They had several different doctrines, different teachings. Some of them were, all of them that were extreme or terrible. We find through historians. Number one, the Sadducees were extremely self-sufficient. Now, probably due to their money that they had. And so in being self-sufficient, they didn't really, in their way of thinking, they didn't have a need for God. Now, they believed God, don't get me wrong. But God was for them this outside deity, this outside power, and he didn't involve himself, according to the Sadducees, in everyday life. He kind of just sat there, if you will. He was just there. And so the Sadducees didn't believe in God's involvement. They didn't believe in the providence of God, the workings of God. A second thing they did is they denied the resurrection. They denied that there really was anything beyond this life. That they resisted really the idea of, when you get back and you look in the book of Acts, you see the Sadducees again. And what they did was in the book of Acts, they denied the teachings of Paul and others concerning the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They really thought, to use the old expression, they thought that once you died, you were like your pet dog Rover, you were dead all over. In other words, there was nothing beyond this life. A third thing that they believed in is denying the afterlife. They just basically, as we said, they held to the soul perished at death, and there was no penalty for the life that you lived, nor was there a reward either. There was no penalty. And the fourth thing, they denied the existence of the spiritual world. In other words, they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in demons, they didn't believe in the spiritual world. That was there and is everything that you study, everything I've ever studied in the past and did for this lesson this week. That's pretty much the basic tenets of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were really not afraid of Jesus till they were afraid of Jesus. In other words, they weren't afraid of Jesus' teachings till all of a sudden, in their mind, he began to be a troublemaker. Now, their view of troublemaker might be different than ours, but their view of troublemaker was somebody that was ultimately going to cause Rome to come in and take over the land and rule it harshly. And so they then, after a while, began to set their sights on Jesus. Because, as we said, they saw him as a troublemaker. They saw him as someone that they needed probably to put in his place. That's why we entered into the two conversations that we have this morning. So remember this, if you walk away and say, okay, what did Preacher Paul, what was he trying to get across? Well, the Sadducees believed in the old law, but they were loose with it. They basically, that was their law, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Didn't believe in the afterlife, didn't believe in the workings of the Lord. Were more concerned with Rome. Here's how one author characterized them in probably one sentence. He said the Sadducees were rude, arrogant, power hungry, and quick to dispute with those who disagreed with them. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Now, when you think about the Sadducees, you say, well, they ended in AD 70 and destruction of Jerusalem. The answer to that would be yes. Why come? Don't know. Like I say, we really have to lean upon Josephus and other historians of that time, and everything we pretty much have in the Pharisees is secondhand. It's kind of interesting. As I really thought about that, and I hadn't in a while, excuse me, but as I began to think about it this week, I thought, that's interesting because most folks with means, they believe their legacy is found in the records that will be found about them after they leave. In other words, what can you tell about my story? And I want to see my story written down before I pass on so that my story looks good. So it's interesting that they didn't do that. Having said that, let's look now in Matthew chapter 16. As we look at the conversations with Jesus, it's interesting that in this little paragraph here, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are wanting a sign. It's true today. Don't we all want a sign? If the Lord would just speak to us, if the Lord would just tell us, if the Lord would just show us. And we read on Facebook, and not just Facebook, but all other kinds of things today, and hear it in movies and magazines. Of course, you have to read digital magazines now. You're going to read magazines. But we realize that folks still today, they want a sign. Oh, I saw a red bird. I was listening to the radio I listen to the radio every day, but I was listening to the radio. This has probably been I don't know, 8, 9, 10 months ago. And this girl, one of the DJs, she had just recently bought a house. And they said, well, why did you pick this house? And she said, well, when I showed up to this house, when I began to walk in the front door, a redbird, a cardinal, showed up. And she said, I just thought that was my mother, and that was the sign that I was supposed to buy this house. Which is interesting because I was coming from the house and I was turning right here down this drive because I always park right here by this side door. And I saw a cardinal and I thought, well, maybe I was supposed to be here today. But then if you really stop and notice, that cardinal's there almost every day. I guess I'm supposed to be here every day. I don't know. That would be great. That would be great. Well, I am, and you know that. You know, that's true. And so we're all looking for that, admittedly. And so in Matthew 16, we see this. We see the Pharisees and the Sadducees seeking a sign. It says the Pharisees and the Sadducees came testing him. They wanted to discredit him. That's really the word testing here. We think, well, they're putting him to the test. And that is part of that word, that Greek word. But it's also the idea that they wanted to discredit him. They wanted to put Jesus to an open shame. They wanted to prove that he was a false teacher, that he was a liar, and see if they could discredit him. Then what happens? Think about it. What happens? You discredit a teacher that is gaining a following. Following then just trickles back home. Now remember, this may not be your way of thinking, but it's always my way of thinking. When you think about New Testament times, they didn't have television. They didn't have shopping malls. They had a market, but they didn't have shopping malls. They didn't have anywhere to gather, so to speak. Now they had gathering places that they gathered and talked. I don't mean that. But they didn't have full-on entertainment. I mean, we walk in our house and we probably do one of two things. We pick up a book and read it, or we turn the TV on. More than likely, we turn the TV on and pick up a book and do the same. Or now we pick up our tablets or turn on our computers, whatever, and begin to be entertained. That way, they didn't have that. They had books. Let me make sure you understand. They had books. But they didn't have continual visual entertainment. So what did they do? Well, they gathered. They followed. Those that had jobs that weren't where you were tied down to a piece of property, you moved from place to place. You followed a teacher. You listened to him, you heard what he said, you liked what he said, and so you followed him. Jesus had a constant, large following. Think about the day he fed 5,000. Remember, they'd been with him. They'd been with him all day. So this was just common practice. If the Pharisees and Sadducees, especially the Sadducees who we're talking about this morning, if they could discredit Jesus, then all of these people are going to go their separate ways. As they go their separate ways, then Rome's going to say, oh, there's not a disturbance in the land. We keep peace. That's what they would. So as they discredit him, or try to discredit him, they ask him, show us a sign. The question is as Matthew paraphrases, they tested him, discredited him, asking him what? That he would show them a sign from heaven. Show us a sign. This could be, of course, anything. Show us a sign with regards to, you're who you say you are. Show us a sign with regards to what's going to happen tomorrow. Show us. Matthew doesn't tell us, and the corresponding texts that do not tell us exactly what sign they're after, but Jesus gives us some insight. Look what he says. He answered them, And he said to them, when it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Sound familiar? Sky's red in the morning, red at night, red in the morning, red at night, sailors fly. Jesus said, hypocrites. You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of time. You know how to read the weather. You know when it's supposed to be, in your opinion, it's supposed to be good weather or bad weather. You understand that, but the boldness of what he says. Now, some versions, Ken's ESV doesn't have the word hypocrites. But the word hypocrites is found in a lot of translations because of the text that the translators use. In other words, you're the ones with the mask. Remember the word hypocrites, hypocrites, means one who plays a role. You're the one playing a role. He sees them for what they are. They've come to put him to the test. They've come to sort of out him as being a false teacher. And he in turn calls them hypocrites. You know how to discern the face of the sky. You cannot discern the signs of time. A wicked and adulterous generation seek after a sign. And no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. He doesn't really give them insight. But what was the sign of Jonah? 3 days in, 3 days out. Jesus had been predicting his resurrection. The answer seems kind of strange, but think about who he's talking to. Sadducees who deny that there's going to be a resurrection. Deny the resurrection of Jesus, deny the resurrection of all of us, themselves included. And yet Jesus, in really, you might say, kind of one sentence, tells the Sadducees you're wrong. What does he say? You seek after a sign. There is no sign except it should be given the sign of the prophet Jonah. Some versions don't have the word prophet, but that's all right. They still have all the rest. Except for the sign of Jonah. Jesus, not only here, but in other places, predicted that he would come forth from the grave. And he told the Sadducees the same thing. Now, it is interesting that when you go on, and this is really not so much a conversation between Jesus and the Sadducees, but if you go on in verse 5 of Matthew 16, when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread, and Jesus said, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So in other words, while verse 4 tells us he left them, he departed, he sort of had his peace. Jesus, if nothing, was brief in his answer, in his disclaimer. He pretty much quietened the crowd down, because what do you say after that? If they keep arguing with him, they're creating the disturbance, right? They can't, the Sadducees especially can't afford that in their way of thinking. So Jesus goes across, evidently, according to Matthew, seemingly would go across the Sea of Galilee, and he just reminds those that are around him, beware of the leaven, the influencing agent of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then they reason among themselves, saying, this is verse 7, it is because we have taken no bread. Jesus said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves? Because you have brought no bread, do you not yet understand? Or remember the 5 loaves and 5,000, and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves and 4,000, and how many large baskets you took up? How is it that you don't understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? In other words, why don't you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Now, here's what we could have said. Can you make that a little simpler to understand? Can you really tell us how you feel. But what he's saying, and we get it, and I think probably they got it. Maybe they didn't want to admit it, but got it. And that is, be careful, because these folks are trying to influence you. And be careful of their influencing agent. Then, verse 12 says, they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. I think I want to give them benefit that when they are questioning this idea of bread, that they're just trying to pull more out of Jesus. Give us more. You know, give us more teaching. Give us some more words. And probably Jesus kind of thumped them on the head, so to speak, and they said, "Oh, okay, we'll shut up and listen."
Oh, this kind of be, I'm going to use the word code speak, revelation like. The people of that time that followed him should know what he's talking about. And the people outside that don't know him would not know what he's talking about, so therefore they would get the comparison.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It could be. More than likely, it's just that Jesus was a man of few words, and they should have picked up on it, and probably did. But it could be. Code speak wasn't.
I'm sorry, it's probably.
Well, that's really what it was. Code speak wasn't really until, well, after the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. So you're talking about 40, 50 years on down the road. Yeah, you're more in line with the Book of Revelation.
Right.
And yeah, which is true. I mean, you know, they did do that then because of persecution of Christians.
Well, it's interesting too that here he was talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, but today we would talk about the yeast of TV, movies, the way people act in public, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And all that stuff creeps in because it would have shocked us,
Sure.
30 years ago if you saw some of the stuff that's going on today.
Absolutely.
And today it's just kind of like, whatever.
Absolutely. One of the fashions among the celebrities and the elite of today, and I saw a picture, thankfully it was censored, but Miley Cyrus walked out of her house recently in a dress that was sheer. She did have on underpants, but no bra. And you could see it. And you think, you're doing what? You're going where? She was going out in public like that. So yeah, to your statement, it is interesting how we change through times and what changes. Wasn't it? What was it? Hill Street Blues was one of the shows that I remember that came out, and they were going to show more, and they did. This was public TV. It was on I think it was on ABC, and this was back in the 90s, maybe. They were going to show more. They were going to do more. They used more vulgarity. The show didn't last but a few years. But shock value is what everybody wants, because shock value causes people to talk about you. Yeah, very true. All good, all true. Anything else?
Interesting that the Pharisees and Sadducees they oppose one another, but they come together here. I guess that proves the old saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yes. Turn to Matthew 22. That's where we're headed next. And this is where exactly this happens. Yeah. They needed to, both Pharisees and Sadducees needed to oppose Jesus, because Jesus was a threat. From a religious standpoint, he was a threat. Why? Because he was teaching a new doctrine, a new teaching. He was also a threat because, as we said, the Sadducees wanted to keep peace, and they saw him as a threat from the political standpoint. So the Pharisees saw Jesus more as a threat religiously. The Pharisees saw Jesus as a threat politically. And both wanted him to be quiet. They didn't get along. They didn't agree with each other, those two groups, Pharisees and Sadducees. And remember, we've pointed this out. There were also other groups. There were the Essenes, there were the Zealots, the Hasmoneans, and there were others in the time, but you don't see them mentioned much because they weren't as big as the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they weren't as prominent in the history of Jesus, if you will, as these two groups were. But these groups didn't get along. And it reminds me of this. In our society, in the United States of America, one of the things that is sickening to me and sad to me is not that we can't agree. I don't think we'll ever all agree. Politically, religiously, I don't think we'll ever all agree. But there should be room for us to disagree. And we should do it with love and peace and kindness. And even though we don't see eye to eye, and like I say, we're never all of us going to see eye to eye. We need to give allowance for that individual. I mean, I sat with several folks whenever we went to Hope Lodge Tuesday night. I sat with several folks and talked. These are folks from not here in Nashville. They're from outside of Nashville, but they're coming to Nashville for cancer treatment at the different hospitals in Nashville. And the American Cancer Society has a place where they can come and they can stay for as long as they need to, and they don't have to go home. Well, you talk about one couple I talked to was from Athens, Tennessee, and they talked about we don't have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be here at 7 o'clock, for tests that he has to have, and then be here all day to go home, only to come back the next day. We can just stay here. When I was talking to a couple, they're not of the faith that I am. They're not in the belief that I am. And he made this statement, which is often made. And we're going to talk a little bit about it more than likely, Lord willing, next week in the sermon. But that is, well, there are many roads to heaven. Not the way I read the Bible. But I didn't get up mad and leave him and try to start an argument there. That was not the place, the time, and situation to do that. I sat and continued to have a very enjoyable conversation with him and his wife. Very nice folks, and I hope and pray for them for wellness in his fight, especially against cancer. And I think that's the way we should be. Some folks may say, well, that's naive, that's wrong. It doesn't mean I can't talk to you, and I can't talk to them. Like I say, Tuesday night was not the time and place. But it doesn't mean that I can't talk to them and I can't share with them my thoughts, my ideas, my opinions, and my beliefs with regards to the Bible. But it is to say that we need to get along. And as you turn on the news, and I'm sort of a news junkie, I like news. I like to watch the news. I have to discount most of the news. I don't care who I'm watching. Doesn't matter who I'm watching. I have to discount it. You listen to them, and they often tell you get who they are, and you get what they're trying to do. And when you do that, you can see through them, so to speak. But it is sad we can't get along. But as Jim said, Sadducees and Pharisees, they get gang up on it here. In Matthew 16 was an instance. And in Matthew 22, we have another instance. Anything else? I'll get off my soapbox. Well, Matthew chapter 22, we want to look beginning in verse 23. What about the resurrection? The Sadducees want to know that. Now, go back, just kind of glance back. In verse 15 of Matthew 22, the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle Jesus in his talk. And so they set before him a question with regards to authority, even with regards to the payment of taxes. In other words, who's in authority? If Jesus is claiming authority, which he did. They need to know, well, who's in authority? Because here's the setup when you think about the question of the Pharisees. The question of the Pharisees is Jesus is going to tip his hand when he answers. Look at the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Well, if he says, well, yeah, you got to pay taxes to Caesar, well, then he's in the Pharisee right. Jesus is saying authority belongs to Caesar to run. But if he says no, pay it to him, then he's setting himself up, and Rome's going to come in. You see, they thought it was the ultimate of question. Verse 22 says, when they heard his answer, and we're not going to get into his answer because this is for another time, they marveled and they left him and they went their way. Then came the Sadducees, and that's where we are, because we're talking about Jesus' conversation with Sadducees today. In Matthew 22, beginning in verse 23, the same day, the Sadducees follow up. Who say there's no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise, the second also, and the third, even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 shall she be? For they all had her. When you begin to set up hypotheticals, you go to extremes that sometimes are just somewhat laughable and sad. And when you look at the hypothetical, they being the Sadducees, have set themselves up. They have paraphrased part of the old law. Go back to Deuteronomy 25 if you're interested, and you'll find how this is to go. And they set this up, and you see why I say it's so strange is because how in the world did she kill 7 husbands? You know. Although I will say I know of a man that's on his 3rd wife, and the other 2 have died of natural causes. So, you know, it does happen. But nevertheless, it's just sort of to me, it's sort of funny. And so Jesus answers, because remember now, the Sadducees denied the resurrection. We could get into the idea of polygamy and polyandry. Polygamy is the idea of many marriages. Polyandry is the idea of many husbands. And what were they supposed to do? Was monogamy? Hasn't it always been so? True, yes. Did God allow polygamy? Well, he didn't strike them dead when they did it, but this is not the plan of God. The plan of God was for one man, one woman, one lifetime. Always has been, and as long as the world stands and the Bible is the authority of man, it always will be. I think even Solomon showed the sadness, 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, of all the wives and concubines that he had, and how they, according to verse 4 of 1 Kings 11th chapter, it says they turned away his heart from God. They were foreign women. They were God, little g, followers. And so they had great influence on him. Anyway, in the point of the question is not whether Jesus is going to condemn polygamy or this woman have the number of husbands in polyandry. But Jesus answers. He said to them, you're mistaken. Now their mistake was, as Jesus is going to say, you don't know the scriptures. Their mistake is that they thought there was no resurrection. But yet they're asking a question. It's kind of interesting. They're asking a question about the resurrection. So he says, you're mistaken. You get to the NIV, Jay? And it says what? I know what it says, but you go ahead and tell it first. Verse 29.
You're in error because you do not know the scriptures of the power of God.
Yeah, and you're in error. That's a good way of looking at this word. It's you're mistaken is a good way. It's also a good way. It can also mean that you're deceived, but it can also mean that you're going astray. So it has various meanings about it, but all of those are true and good. You're mistaken, you're in error, you're going astray, you've been deceived. First of all, not knowing the scriptures. Second of all, their second mistake, they didn't know the power of God. They were denying both. As Sadducees, that was their rule, that was their law, that was their belief. And so Jesus condemns them, first of all, without ever answering the question point blank, by just saying, you need to know more. You need a little information. And then he says, beginning in verse 30, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. Think about what he says. He says, in the resurrection, you neither marry nor are given in marriage. He doesn't deny the resurrection. He denies relationships that we've had here upon earth as being part of what will be in the afterlife. So here's the point. It's this for this thought. Now I'm going to connect it all in just a second. When we die and we are in the afterlife, there's not going to be a need for a husband and wife. Now, when we were first married and my wife came across this verse, my sweet wife, we hadn't been married long, she said, that's so sad. Now she says, hallelujah, when she reads this verse. But Jesus' point is that there's not going to be that type of relationship, nor that need of relationship. You don't understand. Then he says, they are like. Doesn't say they are angels. Now, don't get confused into the idea of saying, well, when we die, we become angels. No. You become like angels. Spiritual beings, which actually didn't believe. But like angels of God in heaven. But concerning, verse 31, the resurrection of the dead, have you not read? Yes, the Old Testament existed. Yes, they should have read. They should have been knowledgeable of this. It gets back to the very first, if you will, argument. You didn't know the scriptures. Have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. The full answer comes in two English words. I am. Present tense. Which means what? Abraham's not dead. Isaac's not dead. Jacob's not dead. From the standpoint of, you might say physically they were, yes. But their soul, their spirit lives on. And so he's saying, I'm their God still today, not just past. They are astonished. They couldn't believe that really, in once again, one sentence, he answered their question. Did he rebuke their teachings? Yes. Did he do it in such a way that there was a full-out war and fight? No. Did they believe what he said? No, there's still Sadducees. Go over in the book of Acts 4 and Acts 5. There's still Sadducees. Might he have convinced some? Possibly. Acts doesn't say. But it is interesting that as he goes on and he tells them here, he says, I am. They were astonished. They were astonished in his teachings. And then what follows is interesting because when the Pharisees, verse 34, hears that the Sadducees had come and had been successful. One of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question, and so there's this back and forth. And then the Pharisees again in verse 41 tried to attack Jesus and his teachings. But those are the conversations with the Sadducees. Something somebody likes to say, especially with regards to either text, Matthew 16 or Matthew 22.
All of that even mean, you think about the.
Was it even mean?
Scriptures and scrolls, that the book of Jonah would have been in whatever form that they've been noting about it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
think, and a minor prophet, they wouldn't have believed it anyway.
No.
But still, again, I found that kind of whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been a good story
Right.
for them.
Right.
It's sort of like if I were to bring the Apocrypha, which, I can't lay my hand on my copy right now. I don't know. I haven't seen it in a while. Anyway, if I were to bring the Apocrypha to you, and you would say, well, those are some interesting stories. Bell Dragon and Maccabees and others. Yeah. Do we believe them? No, because when we begin to put them under the test of what we might consider inspired, we find some big flaws in them. Do some believe that they are true and thus be followed? Yeah. So just what you're saying. You're true. So you have to, why do you believe what you believe? Well, I believe the Bible. Well, why do you believe the Bible? Because I believe it's inspired. Well, why do you believe it's inspired? Well, I feel like it carries us back to the series we had not long ago on, what do you believe? And we ran through several things. Anything else? All good. Okay, well, we've got a few more lessons and conversations with Jesus. I didn't write it down. I forgot what next week's is, but we will look at another conversation with regards to what Jesus had. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful for the opportunity to study your word. And while we don't see eye to eye with Sadducees or even with their questions of Jesus, we're thankful for what he revealed. And the fact that he revealed that the sign for him is the resurrection, to prove that he was the Son of God, but also the fact that he tells us that he is still alive today and that he exists. We're so thankful that you do. We're so thankful that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us. We ask now that we'll always live with you and for you, that we'll always do the things that you would have us to do, so that in the end we will be found faithful and be able to live with you eternally. Watch over us now, bless us and keep us. Give us our sins for this prayer in Christ. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.